So, welcome to the Palace of the People. We're delighted to be with you on the native land of the Ohlone people. It's been quite a while since the Living New Deal had held an in-person event, and bringing people together to celebrate is important, especially to do in difficult times like these. So thank you. Thank you for coming out today to celebrate the New Deal, a time when government served working people and the common good. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yes. And thanks to our esteemed speakers, Gray, Gary, and Heather, for reminding us of the principles and legacy handed down to us by our New Deal forebears. When we were making arrangements for Heather Cox Richardson to visit San Francisco, her agent advised me not to set up any interviews before 10 a.m. because Heather stays up all night writing her near daily dispatch, Letters from an American. Some 2 million readers, apparently including many in this room, wake up to find Heather each morning in our inbox. My friend John Tibbetts told me when he came to tonight that reading Heather got him through the Trump years. Some of us are truly relieved when, instead of explicating the fire hose of political drama, Heather posts a photo of a beautiful Maine sunset by her lobsterman husband, Eddie, explaining that she's taking the night off. Yes. A historian, economist, and professor, Heather connects the dots between our past and present, tell us how the hell we got here. Yeah. Night after night, she pounds out a clear-headed analysis of the day's news, shining a light into the dark corners of our politics. She's trying to shake us awake. Yes. And that's the motive behind her new book, Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America, for sale tonight here, in which Heather opens our eyes to the threats to our fragile democracy. If it's any consolation, Heather points out that our nation has been here before. But it's up to all of us to do all we can to shield and nurture our democracy from those intent on tearing it down. Dr. Richardson. We're so grateful to have you here tonight.
So I'm thrilled to be here. As you know, I write about the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the people around him all the time. But I'm especially happy to be here right now for the 90th anniversary and to be here in San Francisco because of 1937. And as you know, although it was not a New Deal project, the Golden Gate Bridge was completed in 1937. And that was always such a symbol of hope and what people could do together. And the reason that I am happy to be talking about this here now is because I'm going to argue that it is the New Deal that dramatically shaped America's life, and that we have been fighting for the New Deal ever since, and that we are no less fighting for it now than they were in 1937. Because the way that this played out was that when Roosevelt was elected in 1932, many of the Republicans who had controlled the government in the 1920s and who firmly believed that you needed to turn government over to business because businessmen were the ones who really knew how to operate an economy, and they looked at what they thought was a growing economy around them, and it proved to them that those businessmen knew what they were doing. They expected to get back to that. And there was this momentary spasm where voters incorrectly put this wild man in charge of the government. And they gritted their teeth and they thought they were going to take the government back in 1936. And then Roosevelt is reelected in 1936. And this is a moment of utter panic. And so something happens in 1937 that we are still dealing with, and that is that a group of Republicans who hated the business regulations of the New Deal, weirdly, they didn't mind the taxes so much. That was part of it, but it was really the business regulation, teamed up with Southern Democrats who didn't like the inroads that the New Deal was making on racial hierarchies within their states, to come together and declare what a government should look like. And they wrote a document called the Conservative Manifesto. And the Conservative Manifesto was an attempt to roll back the New Deal. And it was quite long. It was above the fold in a newspaper. It filled up all above the fold in a couple more pages. And the fact that I'm comparing it to a newspaper is going to matter in just a minute. But in that Conservative Manifesto, they said that the New Deal, which had undertaken to give the American people a new deal than the one that they had had in the 1920s, that New Deal, which regulated business, provided a basic social safety net, promoted infrastructure, and started to protect civil rights. That's really going to take off in the late 1940s and then under Eisenhower. That those things were not the purview of the federal government. And in this Conservative Manifesto, they said, first of all, that the federal government should never regulate business because businessmen had the right to conduct their businesses however they wished and to accumulate as much property as they possibly could, which they would then invest for the good of the rest of the community. It had no business in social welfare legislation because that belonged to the churches. It had no business in infrastructure because that would cost taxes, and that was much better left to individual businessmen who knew best how to invest their capital in such a way that it would promote the country the most efficient way possible. And certainly there should be no interference in the way states organized rights within those states. They doubled down on the idea of home rule, which was a euphemism for southern states being able to keep civil rights however they wanted within their own states. 1937. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. What the New Deal did with the New Deal inherent in it was it resurrected the idea pioneered by people like Abraham Lincoln and, of course, expanded by Grover Cleveland and Theodore Roosevelt. And that it really expanded on that idea that a government belonged to the people. And we've been talking about that again and again and again tonight, that the government belonged to the people. And if you turn the people loose, the people were going to be able to create a fair and a just society with an ever-increasing prosperity for everybody. That's revolutionary. That is absolutely revolutionary. And of course, with that Conservative Manifesto, those people who hated that idea begin to push back, and they begin to develop an ideology for how to tear down that New Deal. Now, that idea of tearing down the New Deal, of taking us back to the 1920s, doesn't get very far at first. You see people like William F. Buckley Jr. in 1951 talking about how much the New Deal and the New Deal government that comes out of the Depression and then World War II and gets, by the 1950s, is going to be picked up by a number of Republicans as well, who don't like the Democrats, and they certainly don't like the New Deal, but they like the idea that it's very popular. And by 1952, they're going to start to embrace it under Dwight Eisenhower. In 1951, people like William F. Buckley Jr. say, listen, we have a real problem with getting rid of the New Deal because every time we go in front of voters with the argument that this is bad for them, that it's hurting their individualism and it's hurting their self-reliance, they vote against us. So this is a problem for us, and we need to think about how we're going to work around that. And what he says is that instead of going forward to individual voters with the idea of a fact-based argument, that those people who want to roll back what is by then known as the liberal consensus, because both people in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party adhere to it, that rather than making a fact-based argument, what people who want to destroy the New Deal should do is simply start from the premise that the government must defend Christianity and must defend what they call free markets, of free market individualism. And when he writes this in 1951 in God and Man at Yale, or The Superstition of Academic Freedom, that's the subtitle of that book, everybody thinks he's bonkers, because they look around them at their growing GDP and at their nice cars and at their homes and at the jobs that they have thanks to the New Deal programs and later on the programs after the war, and they think, why on earth should we want to get rid of this? And then 1954 hits. And when 1954 hits, and in May of 1954, we get the Supreme Court Brown versus Board decision in which the federal government says that it is a constitutional right for black children to go to school in the same kinds of schools that white children do. The idea that the federal government is going to enforce civil rights in the states through the 14th Amendment, which is incredibly important, that's going to be a wedge that is going to take that liberal consensus and convince a number of people that maybe they don't like it so much after all. And by 1954, after Brown versus Board, 1954, William F. Buckley Jr. and his brother L. Brent Bozell turn loose another book called McCarthy and His Enemies, in which they divide the world between capital L liberals, and they're capital L because they are designed to look as if they are like the capital C Communist Party in China, which is really what people are hot under the collar about in 1954 because of the 1949 takeover of China by the Chinese Communist Party. And by that capital L liberal, they don't mean Democrats the way they do today. They mean everybody in the country who has gotten behind the New Deal government. All of those people are cozying up to socialism in this book, in McCarthy and His Enemies, and they are there's a group standing against them, and they are the capital C conservatives. Even though they're not conservative at all, they want to overturn the government, basically, and they want to take us back to the 1920s. But this is where we get the idea that those people trying to destroy this extraordinarily successful government are conservatives. Because they're not, they're radicals. And even people who are reviewing them at the time say, we're not seeing any conservatism in this. That idea, as I say, doesn't take off very far before 54. Then we get the Brown versus Board decision, and then in 57 we get Eisenhower, who has signed on to this government through his version of it called the Middle Way. Eisenhower sends troops to Little Rock Central High School to integrate the high school there. And with that, you see the rise of the kind of language that Buckley has been pioneering since 1955 in National Review immediately after Brown versus Board, in which he said, I told you that this government that was doing all these things you like was going to take white tax dollars and use them for the good of black people. Basically, it's black people he's talking about in that time, although, of course, California is much more interested in Mexican Americans right then. But he says, I told you this was going to happen, and what you're seeing here is communism. White tax dollars going to benefit black Americans. With that argument, you're going to start to see this wedge opening up between those people who believe in the New Deal, believe in a government of the people and by the people and for the people, and those who begin to say, no, that is socialism. That's in 57, 1960. It is, of course, 3 hours later in my time. It is true. And I have been staying up all night, so I'm doing the best I can here. Sometimes my centuries get a little mixed up. 1960, L. Brent Bozell writes Conscience of a Conservative that is going to be published under the name of Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. And that Conscience of a Conservative says, first of all, we need to get rid of the Supreme Court decisions like Brown versus Board, but it also says we should not have business regulation, we should not have the federal government providing a basic social safety net, we should not have federal investment in infrastructure, and we sure as shootin' should not be protecting civil rights in the states. That's 1960. He doesn't run in 60, he runs in 64, and when he does that, under that same ideology that we got back in 1937, when he runs, he picks up the votes of Arizona and 5 deep southern states. With that idea of With that concept that this New Deal government is using white tax dollars to promote African American rights and other minority rights, that's 64 and 65, each political party is going to have to decide whether or not it's going. In 1965, with the Voting Rights Act, each political party is going to have to decide how it is, or whether it is, going to incorporate people of color into its voting blocks. The Republican Party under Richard Nixon in 1968, with the Southern strategy, doubles down on the ideas of Barry Goldwater, quite literally going to Strom Thurmond, who had very publicly switched sides from the Democrats to the Republicans in 64, to say, hey, as long as we're not protecting civil rights, we're going to be with the Republicans. Nixon goes directly to Strom Thurmond and says, if you will stay with the Republican Party, I will not use the federal government to protect civil rights in the states. In contrast, the Democrats have to figure out what they're going to do with the idea of having a multicultural democracy, and they, quite messily over a long period of time, decide that they are going to try to incorporate people of color and women into their larger coalition. So where does that take us now? Where does that leave us now? With the Republican Party, they doubled down on that racism and the cultural issues that said that so long as you are willing to walk away from the New Deal government, we are going to protect white supremacy and you should stick with us. And the Democrats, in contrast, went with, we want a multicultural democracy. And now here we are in 2000 and something. And what we are seeing is the final stage, I can't say it's the final stage in how this question of what the government should do is going to play out. On the one hand, we have the Democrats and those who have joined them. I should not have put it that way right now, because of course that's the fight that we've had. Now we have on one side people, many of whom were Republicans once upon a time, who do in fact believe in democracy. They believe in the idea of a government that responds to the needs of the people, that want to reinforce that want to expand that. And I think if you look carefully, you can see that the current president and vice president, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, have not only deeply embraced the reality of the New Deal government and the legislation that Biden has gotten through Congress when he had very slim majorities there, rivals that of the New Deal. The American Rescue Plan, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act are extraordinary investments in infrastructure, in creating worlds where we can in fact put people back to work, taking us into the 21st century. Those he quite explicitly reaches back to the New Deal for, and when he talks about what work is about and he talks about unions, he is inheriting the language of FDR. Quite literally, the speech he gave in Belvidere, Illinois 3 days ago, had in it not only the language of FDR, it had in it the joy that you talked about, the joy of creation. And he is quite deliberately modeling himself on that. On the other hand, we have people who do not believe that the government belongs to the people. They are explicitly trying to get us back to the world of the 1920s with an extra little soupçon of Christianity in it. But this struggle, I think, is the struggle of our time. But it is a struggle that we have been engaged in for 90 years. And I think many of us believed that the New Deal principles were safe because they made so much freaking sense. And when I was writing for a long time about the successes of the Biden economic program, people kept saying, you know, oh, it's going to be a recession, oh, it's not going to work, oh, this, and I kept saying, we know it works. We know it works. You know what we know doesn't work? Trickle-down economics. That when he says it's going to work, it's not like he's inventing it. We know it works because, look, we did it before. So in this moment, the New Deal matters, not only because I think it has informed the last 90 years, not only because I think it is something that the Biden administration has reached back to, but also one of the things the administration has done that not many people are paying enough attention to is that they have looked to expand the New Deal, intellectually expand it. So the New Deal was an expansion of Theodore Roosevelt's initial vision. Obviously, he got pretty apocalyptic by the time he got into 1912. But his initial vision, which was an expansion of Abraham Lincoln's vision, of using the government to help ordinary Americans. But in each of those previous iterations, the world that people who had power envisioned was a world in which they were trying to support the ability of a man to support his wife and children in a nuclear family, and that person was usually white. What the Biden administration has proposed, and not gotten it through Congress, but I think it's worth thinking about and having on your radar screen because it's really interesting, is centering not men who need work, but children. And if you center children in a New Deal government, you get away from heteronormativity, you get away from racism, you get away from all the class issues, you get away from all the pieces that kept the previous iterations of a government that worked for the people, reinforcing a heteronormative nuclear family. And I find this moment absolutely fascinating. That was the part of the Build Back Better. Remember, they got split into, and what they called the soft infrastructure didn't pass. The child care, elder care, education pieces, all of that. That didn't pass, but I think it's hanging out there. So in terms, I think, of why the New Deal matters today is because it has shaped the last 90 years of our history, but because it is also an encapsulation of the entire American project. At the end of the day, is our government designed to work for everybody, to do what's right for the American people? Or is it designed to create a world in which individuals can monopolize resources and power to control the rest of us? And that's the decision that we are making right now, between now and 2024. And we have, I think, not only that battle to be waged, but also this moment to look forward and to see what each of those things mean. On the one hand, I think we have seen a vision of what this concept could become with the centering of children. On the other side, the person who is the front runner for the Republican nomination has been extremely clear about what that version of the United States is going to look like. And for all that this is a terrifying moment, you stand in this building here, what was created at an equally terrifying moment, and you think of the joy in these doors, for example, which I was looking at, and in the murals, and in the shape, and in the fact that people are complaining about the bricks being dumped in the harbor. And you think, if they did it then, surely we can do it again. So the New Deal matters not only because of our history, it matters because of our future. And I'm so happy to be here celebrating it with you on its 90th anniversary. Congratulations on that. I don't know how we're doing for time. Do you want me to take questions or no? Okay, I'm good.
Any brief questions for Heather?
I have
Yeah.
one of the things that worries me the most is what I see going on with gerrymandering and outright cheating, plotting to steal the election. And I'm just wondering, back in the 30s, was there as much of that going on as well?
That's a great question. So the question was, looking around at us nowadays with the stealing of elections and the gerrymandering and everything that we see around us, and I have to say, if you are not following what's happening in Ohio right now, you really should be. Because although there was a vote, I think it was just last Tuesday, to include in the Ohio Constitution the protection of reproductive rights, the Republicans in the state legislature have said, we don't agree with that, we're not going to do that. And it passed by quite a strong majority. And they said that right now they're exploring taking away from the judiciary the ability to have any say over the laws that deal with reproductive rights. As in, we don't care that you people voted to enshrine reproductive rights, we are going to take them away, even though we're obviously very much in a minority. And it's a fascinating move. Of course, there are going to be lawsuits and there are going to be all kinds of things about that. But it is a moment when people are literally taking away other people's rights. Was the same thing true in the 1930s? Yes, but, and this keeps me up at night. Many things keep me up at night. Remember the 1930s. Everybody says, that kind of a world where you got a small group of people who enforce the laws however they want, that could never happen in America. And my answer is always, it already has. From 1874 to 1965, the American South was a world in which if you were a person of color, if you were a woman, if you were not related to the right people, your life was not worth spit. It might be, they might treat you fine, or it might not be. And so did they do the same things? Absolutely, quite literally. If you look at what happened in Mississippi, again on Tuesday, when oopsie, they didn't have enough ballots in the one black county, the majority black county. That's exactly the sort of thing you would have seen from 74 to 65. That's why 1965 was such an absolutely huge deal, is because the federal government said, cut it out, you jerks. And I paraphrase, but it has happened before. But that should give us all hope, too, because, when Fannie Lou Hamer and all the people were organizing, especially in Mississippi, to get people to vote, the guys who were voting were a few white men. And the civil rights movement managed to get them behind the idea of protecting black voting rights, because they had gotten to the point where they recognized that you could not turn over the government to a handful of thugs, basically, because you were next. And that's, I don't think we're that far from that now.
Thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here. And thanks for the weather, by the way.
What I've been hearing is that a lot of the black population have felt that this administration has not done enough for their concerns. And it's not lost on me, as I'm sure it's not on many people. There is not any diversification. I don't see any brown or black folks here tonight. So I just would love to hear what that keep you up at night.
So one of the things that I would say, first of all, is ignore the polls. Just ignore the polls. Throw them out. For this reason, we are in a moment, not a moment, it's been going on a while, in which there are forces, and I don't mean like woo forces, I'm happy to name them, who are trying to manipulate American politics in what it can only be seen as a hostile light, by making people believe things that aren't true. And this is a theory. This is not somebody it started out as somebody in his basement, actually, but this is a political theory, an organized political theory that's either called virtual politics or political technology, and there are literally handbooks for how to do this. There's a number of steps that one takes to convince voters that they are, to convince them to vote in ways that work against them, or to convince them to walk away from the political system. So one of them is, rather than trying to clamp down on information that people get, which people immediately recognize as being authoritarian, you flood them with so much information they have no concept of what's going on. They lose faith in it, they get overwhelmed, and they either become apathetic or they turn to a strong man to work for them. You run candidates with similar names to your opponent's candidates. We've seen this in Florida repeatedly. You run candidates who switch sides. They run as one thing and they switch to another side. You flood the zone with disinformation. So back to the polls. So polls can be very useful, and they used to try to be very useful, but it all depends on the sampling and the methodology that's used. And I'm not saying there aren't good pollsters out there, there are, but if you think about the 2022 election, remember the red wave? Every poll, and that should be in quotes, said there's going to be this red wave, right? But there's one guy I follow, a guy named Tom Bonnier, and he looks at the polls and he does the cross checks with registrations in that demographic. And he kept looking at those polls and going, before 2022, and he said, I am not seeing a red wave. I am seeing the Democrats doing really, really well. And here's why, and he'd read it all. So right now, anything that says, for example, that different groups are disaffected, maybe. There are certainly reasons for them to be, but that election's still a pretty long way out, and there's an awful lot of stuff that could happen between now and then, and is happening. So there's certainly plenty of, everybody should be getting to work if you care about this election, but anybody who tells you it's a lost cause, you have to assume at this point is trying to depress turnout. And that may be, in fact, exactly what's going on with those polls.
Do you consult with the administration or
No.
advise?
No. Do I consult with the administration? And the answer, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have put it that way because I respect this administration very much. But I think one of the real sources of my ability to have, I hope, a historical perspective is that nobody owns me. And maybe my kids. I am happy to talk to members of the administration, and sometimes I do. Do I ever call them? No. Because I want information. But my rule is I only want public information because I'm trying to keep the record of this time. So if you call me up with something secret, I can't put it, I know something that the public doesn't know. I don't want to know anything the public doesn't know. But here's a better answer to that, and that is that I will take information from anywhere it comes, which is how I get some of my best scoops. So one, of course, I was one of the first people to talk about the trains that were too long in the country. That was somebody wrote to me and said, please don't use my name, please don't identify me, but my boyfriend is on one of these trains and I'm terrified he's going to get killed. And I'm like, trains? Choo-choos? What's the problem? And then I spent a day looking up trains and choo-choos and discovering there was really a problem. All public knowledge, but it wasn't being focused on. So I do get wonderful tips from just people who watch the news and say, hey, did you see this? Or are you paying any attention to that? But they are not from the administration. I will say one thing though, you do this enough, you get a feel for stuff. And I'm so proud of this. I started writing the piece about suing Amazon the day before it happened because I knew it was the anniversary of the creation of the Federal Trade Commission. And I was going to write about the Federal Trade Commission anyway. And I was just like, Lina Khan, they've been at this a while. I bet there's going to be an announcement tomorrow. And so I was like, yes, I got that one. And that's what a good historian does, is if you know your subject well enough, you can kind of predict what comes next. And I was so proud of that. What I was not proud of was I didn't expect it to be there was as much to write about. So I really, really, really wanted to write about the Peugeot Committee, which was the committee that looked into how much the 19th century and early 20th century economy was controlled by very few people, led by J.P. Morgan. And then the administration had too much to say. There was a speech or something. And I was like, damn, that was really good material. And so I left it open on my laptop, and I couldn't find a time to use it. And then, as you know, within the last week or so, I'm like, there's my Peugeot Committee moment. And that's why that came in then, because I was looking at it from that day before. So, no, I don't consult with them, but I'm happy to. If anybody has great information, I'm always eager for it. One more, she says?
Okay, so we have two final questions.
Could you speak for a moment about the Supreme Court and
Why, is something up with them?
in historical
there you go.
perspective and maybe give us some hope.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I'm not sure I can give you hope, but I can give you historical perspective, and that is, and I should write about this because there's a piece in this. We have had an equally reactionary Supreme Court in the past that everybody forgets about. And if we have lawyers here, you know, we all talk about the Lochner era court. I find that fascinating because nobody actually remembers the Chief Justice, Melville Fuller. It's the Melville Fuller Court, and that is important because the Fuller Court, they did Plessy v. Ferguson, they did, which, you know Plessy, right, the separate but equal. They did Pollock v. Farmers Loan, which says that the government has no power to tax. They did In re Debs, which said even 3 months after we don't have power to tax, they said, but we do have power to go after an individual. They did, well, they did Lochner. They did Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock, which said that the Indian treaties were just whatever. The Congress could do whatever they wanted. And they did the insular cases. Every single one of those cases has been overturned either by constitutional amendment or by law since, with the exception of the insular cases, which says to me it's high time we re-examine the insular cases, which are the ones that say it's okay for it's all about sugar. Basically, it says it's okay for the United States to take territories without actually making them states. So we get territories that are unincorporated territories and non-citizen nationals because they are, what is the phrase? They are of this country. Yeah, but there's the Supreme, do we have lawyers here? There's the line in the insular cases is they are of this country but not part of it. I mean, it's something completely nonsensical. Anyway, so one of the things about this Supreme Court is it's not going to stand, but they can do a lot of damage until they stop standing. So one thing to look at is the court that FDR inherited that kept knocking down the New Deal until he finally threatened them, basically, and said, we're going to add more seats to the court. And magically, they started to moderate their behavior. And that is, to a teeny extent anyway, we're seeing it in the Supreme Court where Clarence Thomas has recused himself from a January 6th case, which you know he would not have done were they not facing the kind of problems they're facing now. And Amy Coney Barrett appears to be backing away from, both she and not Gorsuch, the other one, Kavanaugh, appear to be backing away from their extremism on two pieces. That to me is still not enough because I don't like them. But I will say that there is something else going on, and that is Clarence Thomas is very badly compromised. And I would argue Samuel Alito is as well. And it is, it kind of surprises me that more of us are in the streets over certain things. And all I can say is I would urge people to keep up pressure, certainly on Thomas, who's, I think he's a respectable age to retire, and you didn't used to have to be carried out toes up from the Supreme Court. You really didn't. People used to step down. And Alito, too, you know, Roberts, the reason I mentioned that it's the Melville Fuller Court and the reason I should write a piece about it is because Roberts cares about his legacy. And it's just going down the toilet. I mean, he doesn't want to be Roger Taney. So that's the best I can do. I can't necessarily give you hope, but I don't think it's as bad as it was. It's still bad, but I would keep pressure up there, especially on Thomas, because if you can get rid of Thomas, you at least start to move back in a better direction. And the man is corrupt as the day is long. I mean, it's really shocking.
Yeah, I wonder if you don't think today we have a steeper hill to climb compared with similar periods in the 20th century because there's a much greater consolidation of media. And for instance, even though our San Francisco Chronicle has some wonderful journalists, it seemed to be the paper or promoting realtors and big development, big developers. So that even our state senator, I will name names, is promoted by the California Association of Realtors to the extent that property in San Francisco has just gone through the roof. It's really unaffordable for younger people now to think about raising a family. Yeah, so I just think, don't you think that we have a steeper hill to climb because of the consolidation of media and the ownership?
So not a steeper hill, because we have certainly faced this before. We get an independent press in the late 19th century because the press has become so in lockstep with with both of the major political parties and with moneyed interests as well, which is a really interesting story, by the way. In fact, the history of the press in America is a really interesting story. How much time you got? But your point is a very interesting one. The real lack is the lack of local media. We need local media. But you can see it starting. Things like the Tennessee Holler, for example, initially was just a guy in his living room, I think. And you can see it in a number of independent voices in this country. And I find this really interesting because, like you, I watch the media, I actually don't watch TV, because I yell at it too much. And Buddy gets depressed. So I go away and he vacuums and watches TV. But there is definitely a problem with today's press. And it is that, at least partly, that it is way easier to report on Donald Trump than it is to report on the Biden administration. Because Trump is a freaking cartoon character. And I gotta tell you, there are nights when I'm just exhausted. And Trump's done something outrageous. And Biden's done something that involves 72 different agencies. He's very fond of 72 agencies at a time. And he's given a speech, and one of his other people has given a speech, and they've gone somewhere, and there's been a commercial, and I'm thinking, Trump would take me 25 minutes. Biden's going to take me 7 hours. Trump would take 25 minutes. Biden's going to take 7 hours. And so I think partly it's Trump is so freaking easy to cover that they do that. But I think it's also that because there has been such cutback in the media, they don't have the educated reporters that we used to have. Remember, every once in a while there would be some tragedy and you'd get two old guys, Eric Sevareid and somebody, and they'd be like, well, remember in 1917 when they wrote that treaty, and they do it off the top of their heads. And nowadays, can you imagine some of these news readers, they'd be like, wait a minute, Chad, what country's that in? But that makes it more difficult. But that being said, one of the things that I have really not seen an article about, if anybody wants to write one, is there are a number of really good independent journalists who have very large followings. Joyce White Vance, Tyler Bryan Cohen, Anthony Davis, I'm not doing the substacks here, Judd Legum, the Tennessee Holler, and they have large, I'm talking hundreds of thousands of people. And when we talk about the media, people don't talk about them. They talk about, USA Today, which is fine. USA Today has actually been having some good stuff in it. But I would love to see a study of how many people are actually getting their media from somebody other than that mainstream media we hear about. So there was something the other day where somebody wrote a ridiculous article and people got all upset about it. And I thought, well, last night, 1.5 million people read my version of that, which was right. And nobody's talking about that as if it's not happening. So I'm not entirely clear about that relationship. And the reason I care about the relationship between the mainstream media or the legacy media and those of us who are operating in the shadows is because in 1890, which I know you all think about a lot, but in 1890, the election was sewn up. Midterm election of 1890 was sewn up. The Republicans were going to win. Everybody knew that. And in the American West, in the plains, the farmers got together and said, this government is not working for us. And they started to have picnics. And they had picnics that were not radical picnics by any stretch of the imagination. They would say, do you understand how the tariff works? Do you understand how kickbacks on the railroads work? Do you understand why it costs so much to get your grain to market? And they started to publish newspapers. hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of newspapers. And when and these newspapers were essentially ephemera, so they started in South Dakota, and none of them exist any longer. None of them exist. I know I tried to find them. And they found a wonderful archivist who said, this was my dissertation, and the answer is no longer do they exist. And I'm like, great, at least my dissertation had some documents behind it. But she was actually a wonderful, wonderful archivist. But the reason I mention that is because when the election day hit, the Republicans went down in flames. They lost the House by 2-1. They lost control of the Senate. They still had the presidency because it was a midterm election, but there is this wonderful moment where a woman is visiting Benjamin Harrison in the White House, and they walk in the garden, and she said, you know, he just kept walking around saying, I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened. All I know is it wasn't my fault. And in this moment, the reason I mention that, of course, is this is the roots of the populist movement. And nobody in the East saw it coming, because they were only paying attention to the legacy media. They were only paying attention to the New York Sun and the New York Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Boston Globe. And they were paying attention to that, and they weren't paying attention to these nobodies who were writing these stupid papers that nobody was reading, except it turned out everybody was reading them. And they ended up completely upsetting the apple cart. So I would love to have people, no, I guess I would rather people didn't know this was happening. But when I say millions of people, you all know me at this point, but I am not the only one. There's a lot of people you probably have not heard of who have millions of followers and are doing this same thing. There's a woman named Sharon McMahon. Does anyone know Sharon McMahon? Okay, she has a YouTube something, I think. She has over 1 million followers. She went to give a lecture in Utah, and it was I think it was an 8,500 seat venue. She sold out in under 10 minutes, and within the last 4 months or so. And you see that and you think, maybe something else is going on here, and maybe it's the same kind of thing that FDR tapped into in 1932, and then again in 1936, and gave us the world we live in today. So, as I say, that's kind of what gives me hope.
Then here's to upsetting the apple cart. Thank you so much, Heather and Aaron and Gary. Thank you so much for your generous words, and thanks everyone for coming and for your generosity. And let's look forward to a new deal. Thank you.